The decision to deploy federal troops into American cities represents more than just a tactical move. It marks a fundamental turning point in how the state conceives of its relationship to its own people. When soldiers, trained for combat against foreign adversaries, are sent into neighborhoods, streets, and public squares, the message is unmistakable. Dissent, protest, and even public assembly are being reclassified as threats to national security. This is the logic of authoritarianism, where the border between citizen and enemy collapses, and the population itself becomes the battlefield. What makes this moment so dangerous is not simply the physical presence of troops, but the ideological transformation it signals. It tells us that the government is no longer content to police through ordinary legal means. It is instead willing to escalate, to militarize, and to frame politics itself as war. In a healthy democracy, the use of force against citizens is always understood as a last resort, a failure of dialogue, compromise, or justice. Yet here, the opposite is true. The deployment of troops is not a reluctant measure, but a deliberate show of power staged to communicate dominance. It is meant to intimidate communities, to dissuade them from gathering, and to remind them of the state's monopoly on violence. When an administration uses the language of law and order to justify such moves, it is important to ask whose order is being preserved and whose law is being enforced. History tells us that these questions rarely favor the marginalized or the powerless. Instead, the heavy machinery of the state tends to shield those already protected by wealth and privilege, while punishing those who dare to challenge systemic inequality. By framing protests as chaos or insurrection, the state effectively erases the legitimacy of public grievances. The voices demanding racial justice, economic equality, or climate action are reduced to caricatures of disorder, enemies of stability who must be subdued. But this framing is itself an act of violence, a denial of democratic participation. When the government declares that peaceful assembly is indistinguishable from insurgency, it cuts the cord that binds a society together through dialogue and representation. Instead of listening, it silences. Instead of negotiating, it commands. Instead of seeing citizens, it sees threats. This transformation is profoundly corrosive, for it reshapes the meaning of citizenship itself. No longer are people participants in a shared project of governance. They are subjects to be managed, contained, or controlled. This inward turn toward military force also reveals something deeper about the psychology of power. Leaders who are secure in their legitimacy do not need to deploy soldiers against their own populations. They rely on persuasion, policy, and consensus to maintain stability. The use of troops signals something else entirely: a loss of confidence, an admission that the social contract has frayed to the point that it can no longer be maintained without coercion. The sight of soldiers patrolling city streets, armed and uniformed, is not a demonstration of strength, but of fear that people will no longer accept the terms of their subordination, fear that the myths of order and prosperity have collapsed under the weight of reality. In this sense, the troops are not just confronting protesters, they are confronting the specter of democratic resistance itself. There is also a historical echo that cannot be ignored. Societies that normalize the use of military force against their populations rarely remain democracies for long. The presence of soldiers on the streets may begin as an exceptional measure, justified by crisis, but it quickly becomes precedent. Once the machinery of internal militarization is set in motion, it tends to expand its reach today against protesters, tomorrow against striking workers, next year against any group that disrupts the image of order. Each deployment chips away at the boundary between democracy and authoritarianism until the distinction no longer holds. What remains is a permanent state of emergency in which power is preserved not by the consent of the governed, but by the constant threat of violence. Critics often point out that soldiers are not trained to de-escalate conflicts in civic settings. Their presence can heighten tensions, provoke confrontations, and create a climate of fear that discourages ordinary democratic participation. When residents see armored vehicles in their neighborhoods, when they hear helicopters overhead and encounter troops at demonstrations, they internalize the message that dissent is dangerous, perhaps even life-threatening. Over time, this creates a chilling effect. People withdraw from public life, communities grow more isolated, and the public sphere withers. What is left is a hollow democracy, one in which elections may still occur, but the spirit of civic engagement has been suffocated under military boots. Yet the most insidious effect of troop deployments lies in the way they reshape imagination. Once soldiers become part of the civic landscape, people begin to see them as normal, even inevitable. Children grow up thinking it is ordinary to see soldiers patrolling city streets. Citizens begin to accept that protest carries the risk of facing armed troops. The extraordinary becomes mundane. This normalization is what allows authoritarian systems to consolidate power without constant resistance. People no longer question what has become routine. The danger is not just in the deployment itself, but in the long-term reprogramming of society to accept militarization as the natural order of things. And still, resistance persists. History has shown that when governments treat their people as enemies, they may silence voices temporarily, but they cannot erase them. The memory of injustice lingers, and it fuels new movements, often more determined and resilient than before. Troop deployments may scare some into silence, but they also radicalize others, teaching them that the system will not listen unless it is forced to. What begins as an act of repression can, paradoxically, plant the seeds of broader rebellion. Power that relies on violence always underestimates the capacity of people to imagine alternatives, to organize, and to resist. Thus, the significance of sending troops into American cities cannot be understood merely as a political maneuver of the moment. It is a turning point in the story of democracy itself. It tells us that the state has chosen to confront rather than engage, to suppress rather than listen. It reveals both the fragility of power and the courage of those who stand against it. Most importantly, it raises the question of what kind of society America is becoming, one that resolves conflict through dialogue and justice, or one that increasingly sees its own citizens as enemies to be subdued. By turning inward with force, the government has shown its hand. Whether the people accept this redefinition of democracy or resist, it will determine the future not only of U.S. politics, but of the very meaning of freedom in the 21st century. The language of law and order has long been a political instrument wielded not as a neutral call to peace, but as a way of maintaining existing hierarchies. At its core, it suggests that unrest is born not from structural injustice, but from individual misbehavior, and that the solution is discipline rather than reform. When leaders invoke this phrase in moments of crisis, they are rarely addressing the root causes of people's anger: inequality, corruption, dispossession, or the hollowing out of public services. Instead, they recast these crises as problems of control, as if the only thing needed is a stronger hand. This rhetorical sleight of hand shifts attention away from systemic failures and places the blame squarely on the shoulders of the people most affected by them. To understand how this works, one must first examine the broader social context. Across American cities, decades of economic disinvestment have left entire communities with crumbling schools, inadequate health care, unaffordable housing, and scarce job opportunities. These are not accidental conditions. They are the result of policy choices that favor privatization, deregulation, and austerity. The beneficiaries of these choices are easy to identify: corporate interests that profit from weakened labor protections, developers who exploit housing markets, pharmaceutical companies that thrive on inflated costs. Yet, when citizens mobilize to demand accountability, they are not met with acknowledgement of these structural issues. Instead, the government frames their protests as threats to stability. In this way, law and order becomes a shield, deflecting attention from those truly responsible for the conditions of crisis. The power of this framing lies in its ability to transform public perception. If unrest is understood as a breakdown of law rather than a reaction to injustice, then the logical solution is enforcement. Cameras capture burning cars or broken windows, and these images are circulated as evidence of chaos. Rarely do they linger on the overcrowded hospitals, the eviction notices, or the staggering lines at food banks that constitute the daily reality of the protesters. Media, often complicit in this reframing, amplifies the narrative of disorder, making the call for more policing or even military presence appear not only reasonable, but necessary. This creates a vicious cycle. Structural crises generate protests. Protests are depicted as chaos. Chaos justifies repression, and repression leaves the underlying problems unaddressed, setting the stage for the next eruption. The phrase, law and order, is particularly effective because it plays on fear. For those not directly engaged in protest, the sight of unrest on television or social media can provoke anxiety about personal safety or economic stability. Leaders exploit this fear, presenting themselves as protectors who will restore calm. What is obscured is that the very policies of these same leaders have contributed to the conditions producing unrest in the first place. A community devastated by job losses or police violence is not calmed by more troops on its streets. It is further alienated. Yet, for distant observers, the optics of uniformed officers and armored vehicles can signal control, creating the illusion that problems are being solved. In truth, they are being buried under the weight of repression. It is crucial to see how this strategy serves the interests of power. By focusing attention on criminal, protesters, political leaders, and economic elites avoid scrutiny of their own actions. The billions siphoned from public budgets into private hands, the deregulation that allows corporations to pollute with impunity, the tax policies that enrich the wealthy at the expense of ordinary people. All of this recedes into the background. The spotlight is trained instead on those who resist, casting them as villains in a morality play where the state stands as the guardian of order. In this narrative, demanding justice becomes indistinguishable from causing trouble, and those who benefit from injustice are shielded from responsibility. The deployment of law and order rhetoric also has a corrosive effect on democratic culture. When dissent is framed as a problem of criminality, dialogue becomes impossible. Citizens are no longer treated as voices to be heard, but as disturbances to be managed. This delegitimization of protest undermines the very idea of participatory politics, replacing it with a politics of control. Democracy withers when the act of speaking truth to power is met not with debate or reform, but with batons and tear gas. Over time, people internalize this message, concluding that the system is incapable of listening. Some are silenced out of fear, while others radicalize, convinced that only more confrontational forms of resistance can pierce the wall of repression. This is why the constant invocation of law and order should be understood as a form of propaganda. It presents itself as neutral, even benevolent, but its function is deeply ideological. It tells citizens that the real problem is not inequality or corruption, but the people who refuse to quietly accept them. It reframes legitimate demands for justice as dangerous disruptions, thereby criminalizing dissent itself. In doing so, it aligns the state with the interests of the powerful, preserving existing hierarchies under the guise of protecting the public. The irony, of course, is that genuine order cannot be created through repression. Stability that rests on silencing voices is fragile, brittle, and always at risk of collapse. True order emerges from justice, when people feel that their grievances are heard, their needs are met, and their rights are respected. But justice requires structural change, and structural change threatens the privileges of those in power. This is why the language of law and order is so seductive to elites. It allows them to promise stability without making the sacrifices that justice demands. They can appear strong, decisive, and protective while continuing to preside over a system that breeds instability at its core. When we hear leaders call for law and order, in response to protests, we must ask, what would happen if the same urgency were directed toward solving the underlying crisis? What if the billions spent on militarized policing were invested in affordable housing, healthcare, or education? What if the resources used to suppress dissent were instead used to address the injustices fueling it? The fact that such questions are rarely entertained tells us everything we need to know about the true purpose of this rhetoric. It is not about solving problems, but about preserving power. To see through the myth of law and order is to recognize that order without justice is merely repression. It is to understand that peace achieved through force is not peace at all, but silence imposed by fear. And it is to insist that real stability can only come from addressing the very inequalities and failures that the rhetoric of control seeks to obscure. As long as leaders continue to hide behind this phrase, communities will continue to suffer and unrest will continue to return. The cycle will not be broken until society demands that justice, not fear, be the foundation of order. Normalizing the presence of soldiers in civic life is one of the most dangerous shifts a democracy can undergo because it quietly transforms the boundaries between policing and warfare. What begins as an exceptional measure justified by crisis slowly seeps into everyday governance. Once troops patrol the streets, once armored vehicles line the avenues of protest, the line separating civil authority from military force begins to blur. Citizens accustomed to calling police for protection now encounter soldiers trained for combat, and the message this sends is unmistakable. The state no longer sees its people as a community to serve, but as a population to control. Over time, this normalization erodes civil liberties in ways that can be difficult to reverse. The distinction between policing and warfare has always been tenuous in societies grappling with inequality and dissent. But the open deployment of troops collapses it entirely. Soldiers are not trained to de-escalate conflict. They are trained to neutralize threats. When the state places them in urban neighborhoods, at rallies, or outside government buildings, it signals that political disagreement is not a matter for dialogue or negotiation, but a battlefield scenario requiring suppression. This mindset shifts how both authorities and citizens view protest. For authorities, dissenters become combatants. For citizens, exercising their rights begins to feel like an act of war against their own government. The chilling effect of this transformation is profound. People retreat from public life, fearing confrontation with an institution that wields overwhelming force. The normalization of military presence also reconfigures the social contract. In democratic theory, governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. Consent presumes trust, participation, and the possibility of accountability. But when armored vehicles become fixtures of the civic landscape, the idea of governance shifts from mutual obligation to enforced obedience. The unspoken contract becomes stay quiet, stay compliant, and the machinery of the state will not turn against you. This is not the logic of democracy, but of authoritarianism. Civil liberties, once taken for granted, are slowly whittled away, not by a sudden declaration of dictatorship, but by the incremental embedding of military force in daily life. There is also a psychological effect that must not be underestimated. For communities already subject to over-policing, the arrival of troops compounds an existing sense of siege. Children grow up seeing soldiers at intersections, their formative understanding of politics shaped by uniforms, weapons, and checkpoints. They internalize the belief that dissent is abnormal, dangerous, even criminal. Adults, too, begin to recalibrate their expectations. They accept surveillance cameras, curfews, and patrols as normal aspects of life rather than extraordinary impositions. The extraordinary becomes ordinary, and this normalization makes resistance more difficult. Once militarization is embedded into the rhythms of daily existence, it no longer sparks outrage. It simply becomes the air people breathe. From the perspective of power, this normalization is highly effective. It allows the state to expand its reach without constant justification. At first, officials insist that troops are temporary, deployed only until order is restored. But over time, the definition of order shifts. Protests need not be violent to trigger a military response. Any gathering large enough to challenge authority can be deemed a threat. What was once justified as a response to emergency becomes routine, a permanent feature of governance. The result is a society in which every act of dissent is shadowed by the possibility of armed confrontation, where citizens must constantly weigh the risks of exercising their rights. This erosion of civil liberties rarely happens with a single dramatic act. It is gradual, creeping, almost invisible to those not directly targeted. A protest in one city leads to deployments. People elsewhere tell themselves it is a local matter. A new law authorizes broader military involvement in domestic security. Those not protesting barely notice. Each step seems minor in isolation, but together they add up to a fundamental transformation. By the time people realize how far the line has shifted, the infrastructure of militarization is already firmly in place, and rolling it back appears impossible. History shows us that once states have tasted the efficiency of military solutions to civic problems, they are reluctant to relinquish them. The normalization of troops in civic life also undermines the legitimacy of other institutions. Courts, legislatures, and local governments are sidelined when force becomes the primary tool of governance. Decisions that should be made through democratic deliberation are instead resolved by shows of power. This hollows out the democratic process, leaving behind shells of institutions that still exist in form but have lost their substance. People may still vote, judges may still preside, and councils may still meet, but the ultimate arbiter is the presence or absence of soldiers on the streets. Power migrates from ballots to boots. The danger is not only internal. A society that accepts militarization at home is more likely to justify aggression abroad. The same logic that treats protesters as insurgents can be extended to foreign policy, where the line between domestic security and international conflict blurs. A government comfortable using soldiers against its citizens is also comfortable using them to expand its influence elsewhere. This creates a feedback loop. Militarization abroad justifies militarization at home and vice versa. The country becomes locked in a cycle where war, whether internal or external, becomes the default mode of politics. And yet, the normalization of military presence is never complete. Beneath the surface, resentment grows. People may adapt outwardly, but inwardly, they recognize the absurdity of living in a society where soldiers police civic life. This quiet awareness can smolder for years before erupting into new forms of resistance. What governments often fail to grasp is that force does not resolve the grievances that drive dissent, it only suppresses their expression. The root causes, inequality, injustice, exploitation, remain untouched, and over time they intensify. Eventually, the state finds itself in a paradox. The more it relies on militarization to maintain order, the more brittle and unstable that order becomes. The collapse of civil liberties under normalized militarization is not inevitable, but resisting it requires vigilance. It requires citizens to see through the rhetoric of temporary measures and recognize the long-term consequences of embedding troops in civic life. It requires asking difficult questions about who benefits from militarization and who pays the price. Most of all, it requires a refusal to accept the extraordinary as ordinary, a refusal to allow the machinery of war to redefine the meaning of democracy. Without such resistance, the line between civilian and military will continue to blur until it disappears entirely, leaving behind a society that still calls itself free, but has forgotten what freedom looks like. When governments lean heavily on displays of force to maintain their authority, they often project strength to the public, but beneath this spectacle lies a profound fragility. Power that depends on military deployments, heavily armed police, or constant surveillance is not secure power. It is brittle, anxious, and always aware of its vulnerability. The reliance on force exposes not confidence in governance, but the fear that legitimacy has already eroded. A truly stable administration does not need soldiers in the streets to convince people of its authority. It earns trust through accountability, justice, and the capacity to address the needs of its population. The moment leaders default to coercion, they reveal their own inability to govern by consent. This fragility is not simply symbolic, it is structural. States that lean on repression do so because the foundations of their power, economic security, social cohesion, political legitimacy, have weakened. Citizens may no longer believe promises of prosperity, especially when they see wealth concentrated in the hands of a few while inequality widens. They may no longer accept the narrative that the system is fair, not when police violence, disenfranchisement, and corruption are visible daily realities. In such conditions, people begin to question the contract that binds them to the state. Instead of addressing these fractures with reforms, leaders often reach for the easier, faster tool force. But every time they do so, they expose how shallow their popular support truly is. The paradox of force is that it can suppress dissent in the short term, but magnifies instability in the long run. Troops on the streets may intimidate protesters into dispersing, but the grievances that brought them out remain unresolved. In fact, the deployment itself becomes a new grievance, another symbol of a state that does not listen, another reason to distrust authority. What was once a protest about housing, policing, or wages now becomes a protest about the right to protest at all. In this way, the government's attempt to assert strength only multiplies the fronts on which it is challenged. The more it tries to secure itself through coercion, the more unstable it becomes, caught in a cycle of escalation that it cannot win. This fragility also reveals itself in the narratives leaders use to justify force. They often speak in absolutes, portraying dissenters as enemies, agitators, or even terrorists. Such language betrays their insecurity. Strong, confident governments do not need to demonize their citizens to maintain order. They can tolerate criticism, even welcome it as a vital part of democratic life. But fragile power sees every challenge as an existential threat, every act of dissent as a spark that could ignite rebellion. This is why leaders who lean on force become obsessed with control. They cannot imagine governance without it. Their fear is not of chaos, but of exposure. Exposure of their inability to lead without coercion. There is also a personal dimension to this fragility. Leaders who resort to force often cultivate an image of toughness, presenting themselves as defenders of order who will not bend to pressure. But this projection is a mask, one that conceals deep insecurity about their ability to command respect without intimidation. Authoritarian posturing is less about confidence than about fear of losing face, fear of being perceived as weak, fear of being held accountable. The louder the insistence on strength, the more it reveals the weakness beneath. Citizens sense this dissonance, and it erodes respect for leadership. People may comply outwardly, but inwardly they recognize that their rulers are afraid of them, that the power on display is brittle rather than solid. This fragility becomes most apparent when states overreact to relatively small acts of dissent. A handful of protesters can provoke an outsized response. Curfews, armored vehicles, sweeping arrests. Such disproportionate measures signal that the state is less interested in maintaining order than in sending a message. The message is, we are strong and you are powerless. But in truth, it communicates the opposite. It tells citizens that even minor acts of resistance are enough to unsettle those in power. When governments mobilize soldiers against their own people, they inadvertently confirm what the protesters have been saying all along, that the system is insecure, unjust, and afraid of accountability. Fragile power is also unsustainable because it cannot adapt. A government that rules by consent can adjust its policies, negotiate with citizens, and find compromises when tensions rise. A government that rules by force has only one tool in its arsenal: suppression. This rigidity makes it brittle. Every challenge becomes a confrontation, every disagreement a battle, every protest a threat. Such a government cannot evolve because to concede even a small demand would be to admit weakness, and weakness is the very thing it fears most. This inability to bend eventually leads to breaking. When the population reaches a threshold where fear no longer outweighs anger, repression ceases to work, and the state finds itself facing a legitimacy crisis it cannot manage. History provides ample evidence of this dynamic. From colonial regimes to military juntas, the reliance on force has always produced the illusion of control while masking the erosion of legitimacy. For a time, the streets may be quiet, but beneath the silence, resentment grows. When cracks appear, whether through economic collapse, external pressure, or simply the courage of a new generation, the fragile edifice shatters quickly. What appeared strong proves hollow, built not on trust, but on fear. The very mechanisms that once seemed to guarantee order, soldiers, prisons, surveillance, suddenly look inadequate against the collective will of the people. The irony is that leaders often know this, at least intuitively. Their obsession with controlling narratives, censoring information, and punishing dissent stems from the recognition that their grip on legitimacy is tenuous. This is why fragile power invests so heavily in spectacle. Parades of military might, speeches about toughness, laws promising crackdowns, these are all performances designed to convince the public and perhaps even the leaders themselves that they are unassailable. But no amount of spectacle can conceal the fundamental truth. Power that must constantly prove itself is already insecure. What makes this fragility so dangerous is that it often leads to escalation. Leaders who sense their authority slipping rarely choose humility or reform. Instead, they double down, believing that more force will secure them where less has failed. This escalation deepens the cycle of repression and resistance, pushing societies closer to rupture. In their desperation to appear strong, leaders make themselves weaker, undermining the very stability they claim to protect. Citizens, meanwhile, learn to read the signs. Every deployment, every crackdown, every act of censorship becomes evidence that their rulers are afraid of them. Thus, when governments rely on force to maintain order, they are not revealing strength, but weakness. They are telling the world that they no longer trust their people, that they no longer believe their system can survive on legitimacy alone. The boots on the pavement, the soldiers in the streets, the constant surveillance, these are not symbols of stability, but of fear. True strength comes from the ability to govern without coercion, to command respect rather than demand obedience, to inspire loyalty rather than impose silence. Anything less is fragile power, and fragile power, no matter how heavily armed, is always destined to crack. Resistance has always been the answer to repression. When power tries to silence voices, those voices find new frequencies, new mediums, new strategies to be heard. History is thick with examples whenever authoritarian regimes, colonial administrations, or militarized governments attempted to crush dissent with force. They ended up igniting the very fires they sought to extinguish. The idea that resistance will rise in response to suppression is not a matter of optimism, but of observation. It is the logic of human dignity, the insistence that people cannot forever under a boot without eventually pushing back. What makes resistance so resilient is its adaptability. When streets are occupied by soldiers, people organize in neighborhoods. When media is censored, they create underground networks. When leaders criminalize assembly, dissent flows into art, music, and culture. Repression is never a permanent solution because it cannot erase the underlying grievances that fuel resistance. It can only drive them into new forms. The present moment in the United States echoes these dynamics. Deployments of troops and paramilitary-style police units may discourage some from taking to the streets, but they also galvanize others. The sight of militarized officers dragging away peaceful protesters, of armored vehicles rolling down city blocks, becomes a rallying cry, an image that spreads across social media and news channels, sparking outrage far beyond the initial protest. Every baton strike, every tear gas canister, every unlawful detention adds to a growing archive of injustice. Resistance is not weakened by this archive. It is strengthened because people begin to see themselves not as isolated victims of a system, but as part of a larger struggle. What one community suffers today, another recognizes as its own future, and solidarity grows in that recognition. The power of resistance lies in its ability to transform fear into courage. Authoritarian measures rely on intimidation, on making the cost of dissent so high that people will stay home. Yet history shows that fear has limits. At some point, the constant presence of force stops intimidating and starts enraging. People realize that silence does not protect them, that compliance does not buy safety, that the boot pressed down on their neighbor's neck will eventually find its way to their own. When that realization spreads, fear loses its grip. What remains is anger, and anger, when shared collectively, becomes one of the most potent engines of political change. Resistance also operates on multiple levels, not just in the dramatic moments of protest, but in quieter, less visible acts. Communities build mutual aid networks, provide resources for those targeted by repression, and create alternative systems of care. Students organize teach-ins, artists spread subversive imagery, writers and thinkers articulate visions of freedom that keep hope alive. These forms of resistance may not capture headlines like clashes in the streets, but they are no less important. They lay the groundwork for resilience, ensuring that when movements rise, they are sustained by deep-rooted networks of solidarity. Repression, ironically, often accelerates the building of such networks as people recognize the necessity of mutual support in the face of state hostility. There is also the matter of memory. Resistance movements draw strength from the knowledge that they stand in a lineage of struggle. The United States itself was founded on resistance to imperial domination. The labor rights victories, the civil rights movement, the anti-war mobilizations all testify to the capacity of people to rise against overwhelming odds. When governments deploy troops against protesters today, they are not writing the final chapter of dissent. They are adding another scene in a much longer story, one that has always ended, eventually with cracks in the armor of those who thought themselves untouchable. This continuity of memory ensures that each new generation of activists inherits not just the pain of repression, but also the lessons of resilience. Repression is, by nature, unsustainable. It breeds cynicism among the very soldiers and police officers tasked with carrying it out, who often come from the same communities being targeted. It erodes the moral legitimacy of the government in the eyes of the international community. It deepens divisions within society until the ruling power is surrounded by enemies rather than citizens. Resistance thrives in such environments because it no longer needs to convince people that something is wrong. The government's own actions provide the proof. The question is not whether resistance will rise, but in what form and how quickly. There is always a risk, of course, that resistance is met with even harsher repression. But here too lies a paradox. Every escalation carries the possibility of backfiring. Crackdowns radicalize moderates, bring new people into the movement, and expose the desperation of the state. The images of violence spread faster than the official narratives can control, undermining propaganda and delegitimizing the very institutions meant to maintain order. Resistance, unlike power, does not need to maintain the illusion of invulnerability. It only needs to persist, to endure long enough for cracks to appear. And because it is decentralized, diverse, and adaptive, it is far more difficult to extinguish completely than authoritarian leaders imagine. What makes resistance inevitable is not just anger, but hope. The belief that things can be different. Governments that rely on force try to extinguish hope by convincing people that their efforts are futile, that nothing can change, that power is permanent. Yet power is never permanent. It shifts, it falters, it falls. The very act of resistance, no matter how small, is a reminder of this truth. Every protest, every strike, every refusal to comply is an assertion that history is not finished, that the future is still open. This is why resistance has such endurance. It is fueled not only by rage at injustice, but also by the vision of a better world. The lesson of history, then, is not that repression prevents resistance, but that repression plants the seeds of resistance's next phase. Each crackdown becomes a catalyst, each injustice a rallying point, each attempt to silence a reason for louder demands. Leaders who believe they can maintain power through fear misunderstand the nature of human dignity. Dignity cannot be permanently suppressed. It may be beaten down, imprisoned, exiled, but it finds its way back stronger and more determined. Resistance is not a possibility in the face of repression. It is an inevitability. The United States today is at such a crossroads. Troop deployments and militarized crackdowns may silence dissent in the short term, but they are also writing the script for the next wave of democratic struggle. People are watching, documenting, remembering. They are connecting across cities, across movements, across generations. The state may believe it has won when the streets grow quiet, but silence is not the same as submission. It is often the pause before the next eruption, the gathering of breath before the next shout, the stillness before the next march. Resistance will rise because it always has, and because repression, no matter how brutal, can never erase the human desire for freedom.